so much for being here. I'm Stacy James with Just Spooling Around, and we're going to be learning the basic techniques for increasing the stitch count on any given row, which is just one way to add shape to our projects. So let's get started.
Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to the 4 different sets of increases we'll be learning by showing you how each set of increases stacks up against one another. Okay, we're going to be going over some shaping techniques using increases that have matching pairs. And what that means is that the increase on the right side has a matching increase on the left side, so that we have right-leaning increases right of center and left-leaning increases left of center. What I have here is a swatch of the 4 different pairs of increases we'll be covering. I started with my version of the knit front back, or KFB, which is right-leaning, and the knit back front, or KBF, which is left-leaning. Now, knit front back and knit back front are the technical knitting terms for knitting with needles. But what I've learned is that most people who've picked up hand knitting have never actually knitted with a set of needles. So a lot of the terminology doesn't really make sense because we don't use our hands to knit the way we use needles to knit. I've also learned that a lot of people will avoid the more challenging or complex techniques, which is why I've modified the knit front back and the knit back front increases for my patterns. However, as I believe you may see from my swatch, easiest isn't always the most appealing aesthetically. The first set of increases I've coined as knit purl, or KP, and purl knit, or PK. Each increase involves working both stitches in the same stitch. If you work my panda, heart, or baby heart knit along, you will be familiar with this increase. As you can see here, the result of these increases is a purl bump, one on the left side of the right-leaning increase, and another to the right of the left-leaning increase. I've worked a total of 3 increases for each pair, with the increases taking place on the odd rows and the knit stitches on the return pass, or even rows. Increases are typically worked this way to achieve an even slant along the edges. However, play around with the increases you're about to learn. Some of the most beautiful things are created when we follow our own paths. Now, when we look at the first set of increases stacked up, they're very visible and, I guess jagged maybe is what I'm trying to say, as opposed to the next set of increases, the make one right and make one left, which is rather smooth, but still visible. There's a degree of difficulty that goes along with each new set of increases worked in the swatch. So while this increase isn't difficult per se, it may take a bit longer to work. Next, I work the technical version of the knit front back and the knit back front to show you how it differs from my modified version, both aesthetically and in difficulty. As you can see, they look nearly identical. However, with my modified version, the likelihood of a small opening may present, especially if you tend to use more than one finger to size your stitches. However, this is a more complicated increase to work with our hands. Finally, we have the right lifted increase and the left lifted increase, which is pretty much invisible. However, this is the most complicated increase to work. Now, each set of increases has its own attributes. Which set you choose will depend on the type of pattern you want to create, because you can always change the set of increases you use in someone else's pattern. Now, since many hand knitters have never worked with needles, these techniques can be quite challenging, because I've come to realize there's just nothing out there aside from tutorials of these techniques worked with needles to help hand knitters. So I'm here to help bridge that gap. The more you know, the more you grow in your craft. And that's what I love best, helping people with a shared passion. Now, let's take the first step into learning some new shaping techniques. In segment 2, we'll be learning my modified version of the knit front back and knit back front, which I've coined as KP for knit purl and PK for purl knit. I'll begin with a small swatch of 6 stitches and 2 rows. Each increase will be worked on the third stitch from each edge, so we'll always have 2 stitches along the edges. That puts us right at the middle 2 stitches to begin with. I'll start with my version of the knit front back and knit back front, which I've coined as KP for knit purl and PK for purl knit respectively. Before I get to that, I want to share a tip. Now, normally we knit the edge stitches just a bit smaller than the rest, and that won't be the case when working a series of increases to shape a piece. The edge stitches need to be at least the same size as the rest, and possibly a tad bigger because of the slant. Now, this tip applies only when the stitch count across the row increases. If those increases are offset by decreases to keep the stitch count the same within the row, you will still knit the edges just a tad smaller. All right, now let's knit the first 2 stitches. And here we want to work our right leaning increase. We're going to knit 1, then purl 1 in the same stitch. So let's knit and place it on the right leg. Remember, our stitches have right and left legs, which is extremely relevant for working these increases. Now, we're going to purl 1 into the same stitch on the left leg by bringing our working yarn forward and tightly wrapping it from front to back, drawing up a purl stitch behind this third stitch. We now have 2 stitches in 1, increasing our stitch count by 1. As you can see, this increase results in a small hole as it pushes the legs of that third stitch apart. If you have a tight tension, this is not as noticeable as if you have a looser tension, and is the only aesthetic difference between the knit front back. Okay, next we'll work our left leaning increase with a purl 1 on the right leg, then a knit 1 on the left leg. So we'll leave our working yarn in the front to work our purl stitch. Then we'll bring our working yarn to the back and tightly wrap it from back to front to draw up our knit stitch in front of our third stitch from the left edge. We now have 2 stitches in 1, increasing our stitch count again by 1. Now we'll knit the remaining 2 stitches along with the 8 stitches we have on our return pass. Let's take a look at what we did. Here we can see the stitches where we placed 2 in 1. Here's the bump from our purl stitch on the knit purl, or KP, which is right leaning. And here's the purl stitch on the purl knit, or PK, the left leaning increase. This is our slack between the 2 center stitches from row 2, isn't it? All right, let's do it again. We'll knit the first 2 stitches and work our right leaning increase in stitch 3, the KP. So we'll knit through the right leg, then bring our working yarn forward to purl through the left. We now have 2 stitches in 1, increasing the stitch count by 1. Now, these next 2 stitches are between our 2 increases from the increases we did on row 3. So we'll work those 2 stitches, which brings us to the third stitch from the left, which is where we'll work our left leaning increase, the PK. So let's bring our working yarn forward to work a purl stitch into the right leg. Then place the working yarn to the back of the work and wrap it tightly around to knit through the left leg. We have 2 stitches in 1, increasing the stitch count again by 1. Now we'll knit the last 2 stitches along with the 10 stitches on the return pass. Let's take inventory again. Here are the purl bumps from our increases on row 3. You can see these really well because I've lifted them to make them more defined, but here's what it looks like when I don't lift them. Those purl bumps aren't as noticeable, however, it's not a seamless increase for sure. So here's the bump from our right leaning increase. So when we look at this as a whole, we have our purl bumps here from row 3. This is our knit stitch from the return pass. Then here's that purl bump from the right leaning right leaning increase on row 5, and the left leaning increase bump is here. We'll do this one last time, so let's knit the first 2 stitches. Then work our right leaning increase, the KP, in the 3rd stitch from the right edge. Knit into the right leg, then bring the working yarn forward and purl into the left leg. We have 2 more stitches between our increases, so we'll knit the next 4 stitches, bringing us to the 3rd stitch from the left leg, which is where we'll work our left leaning increase, the PK. Now, before I forget, it's the purl stitches in these 2 increases that is the actual increase. The knit stitches are the regular stitches. Okay, now bring the working yarn forward and purl in the right leg. Then swing that working yarn to the back and knit through the left leg. So here's our increase, and that's our regular stitch. Now we'll knit the last 2 stitches and the 12 stitches on the returning pass. So we can see the trajectory of our increases. Here's the KP on the right and the PK on the left. This is a great increase for decorative purposes as it adds a pattern texture. However, you'll need to apply a different increasing technique if you want something more seamless. In segment 3, we'll be learning how to work the make one right and make one left. I'll begin with a small swatch of 6 stitches and 2 rows. Each increase will be worked on the 3rd stitch from each edge, so we'll always have 2 stitches along the edges. That puts us right at the middle 2 stitches to begin with. So let's knit our first 2 stitches, making sure the edge stitch is just as big as, if not a tad bigger than, the rest to compensate for the diagonal slant. And there's 2. To work on a make one right, the increase will be worked to the right of our 3rd stitch. To do that, we need to expose the slack or thread between the 2nd and 3rd stitches from row 2. Then we pick it up and twist it to the right to knit through the back of this stitch we've just created from the slack on row 2. If we were to knit through the slack without twisting it, the back is right here, we'd be creating an extra stitch on the 2nd row, but then skipping that stitch on the 3rd row. So we have to make the stitch longer to meet up with our 3rd row, and we have a gap under that extra stitch. However, by twisting the slack, we're actually creating an extra stitch on the 2nd row, and knitting through the back of the twisted stitch gives us the 3rd row stitch without leaving a gap under the extra stitch. Without the twist, we're just knitting through the slack, not an actual stitch. And this makes a big difference aesthetically, especially if we've just changed color on row 3. Now, twisting that slack can be difficult if you have a tighter tension, so I find it easiest to use my left thumb to pick up the slack from back to front. And instead of giving it a full half twist, I twist it about a quarter of the way, knowing that the back of this increased stitch we're making is on the side of the tip of my thumb. Then I drop a loop through the back of the twisted stitch. Now we knit through that stitch just right of center to complete the make one right increase. So this is our increase, and the knit stitch we made through the regular stitch is our regular stitch. To work a make one left, the increase will be worked to the left of our 3rd stitch from the left edge. So we need to knit that 3rd stitch first, which is our regular stitch. Now we expose the slack between this and the 2nd stitch from the left. Rather than twist to the right, we'll twist to the left. This increase is a little bit more difficult because we have to give it that full twist to work our knit stitch through it. And this is when I find a crochet hook very helpful. So I've got this tiny hook to work with, but I recommend using at least a 5mm hook. In the process of twisting the slack, I've made this next stitch much too small, so I just need to make a quick adjustment here. Okay, so now we just need to knit the last 2 stitches. Then we knit all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 8 stitches, which is exactly right because we worked a right leaning increase, which added 1 to our stitch count, giving us 7. And then we worked a left leaning increase, bringing our stitch count to 8. Now let's do it again. We know we need our 2 stitches along the edge, so let's knit those 2 stitches. This third stitch is where we want to work our right leaning increase. And to make one right, we need to create a stitch from our slack to the right of this third stitch. We'll place our thumb through the back of the slack and twist it to the right, creating an extra stitch on the 4th row. Now, knit through the back of that extra stitch for the 3rd stitch on row 5. Then, knit the next stitch to complete that increase. We'll have 2 stitches between our increase stitches, so we'll knit those 2, which brings us to the 3rd stitch from the left edge. Again, we'll make one left to the left of this stitch, so we just need to knit it before working the increase. Now, expose the slack to the left of this stitch, using your thumb to twist it left to create the extra stitch on row 4. Then knit through the extra stitch to complete the increase on row 5. Now, knit the last 2 stitches, and we'll knit all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 10 stitches after working our make one right and make one left on row 5. These stitches here are the ones where we work our increases, so let's do this one last time to get a better look at how these increases stack up. Knit the first 2 stitches. On this 3rd stitch, we want to work a make one right, so let's expose the slack to the right of this stitch, using our thumb to twist it to create an extra stitch on row 6. Then knit through the extra stitch to work the increase on row 7. Then knit the next stitch to complete the increase. We now have 4 stitches between our increase stitches, so let's knit those to get us to our 3rd stitch from the left. This time, we want to work our increase to the left of the stitch, so we need to knit it first. Then expose the slack to the left, twist it to the left to create an extra loop on row 6, then knit through it to work the increase on row 7. Now, knit the last 2 stitches, then we'll knit all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 12 stitches. Let's take a look at what we have. We can see the diagonal columns 3 stitches in from the right and left, and the transition between the vertical columns in between is nice and smooth. Now, let's compare the make one right and make one left to the knit purl and purl knit increases. 2 completely different outcomes, each producing key attributes you may consider when designing your own patterns. In segment 4, we're going to learn the technical way to work our KFB or knit front back and KBF or knit back front. I'll begin with a small swatch of 6 stitches and 2 rows. Each increase will be worked on the 3rd stitch from each edge, so we'll always have 2 stitches along the edges. That puts us right at the middle 2 stitches to begin with. The KFB or knit front back is the right leaning increase, so that makes the KBF or knit back front the left leaning increase. These increases add an extra degree of difficulty than the previous 2 techniques. Let's knit our first 2 stitches to get started, making sure the edge stitch is just as big, if not a tad bigger than the rest, to compensate for the diagonal slant. To work the KFB or knit front back, we want to work 2 stitches in this 3rd stitch. So we'll separate our stitch into 2 by working through the right and left legs. First, we'll knit through the right leg. Now, this works similarly to the make one increases. Instead of creating an extra stitch using the slack, we're going to create an extra stitch here on the left leg. And instead of twisting the left leg to the right, we'll twist it to the left. Then knit through the back of the extra stitch created using the left leg from the third stitch on row 2. Now, even though technically we've knitted our extra stitch, a purl bump presents as a result of the twisting on this increase, which we can see here. Next, we'll work the KBF or knit back front in the third stitch from the left edge. This is a bit more difficult. First, we need to twist the entire stitch to the left, which really shrinks the size of the stitch. Now, we'll separate this twisted stitch into 2 by again working through the right and left legs, just as we did on the KFB, knit front back. We're going to knit through the right leg of our twisted stitch. Now, this right leg is what creates the purl bump, which makes this first knit stitch the increase in the KBF or knit back front. Now, we need to work another stitch through the left leg, but we're going to have to twist it first to do so. So using our thumb, we'll twist this left leg to the right, then knit through the back of the extra stitch just created. And I definitely need a crochet hook to get this stitch through. This is a 5mm hook, which is the size I usually use when I'm in need. Okay, so even though the left leg creates that extra stitch, it's the one on the right leg that's the actual increase. Confusing? Absolutely, but that's just how this one works. And now you understand why I created a modified version of this increase, yeah? All right, so let's knit these last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 8 stitches. Now, let's see what we have. We have the KBF or knit back front purl bump here, which is the left leaning increase. And there's the KFB, the knit front back purl bump, the right leaning increase. Now, again, I'm lifting these to make them easier to see, but they won't be this defined in your work. So let's do it again. Knit those first 2 stitches. And here's our third stitch, which is where we want to work our right leaning increase, the KFB. So we'll knit through the right leg first, then we'll create an extra stitch by twisting the left leg to the left and knitting through the extra stitch. And there we have our purl bump. Let's knit our next 2 stitches between our increases, bringing us to the third stitch from the left edge. Again, we're going to knit 2 stitches in this third stitch, but first we need to twist the entire stitch to the left. Then we separate it into 2 by first working a knit stitch through the right leg, which is the increase. Now, twist the left leg to the right and knit through the extra stitch. Here we see that purl bump on the right. Let's knit the last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 10 stitches. And we'll do it again one last time to see how these increases stack up. So we'll knit these first 2 stitches and work the KFB in this third stitch. Knit through the right leg, then twist the left leg to the left and knit through the extra stitch. Here's our purl bump. Knit the next 4 stitches, bringing us to the third stitch from the left edge, which is where we'll work the KBF by first twisting the entire stitch. Now, knit through what's now the right leg. Here's our purl bump. Then, twist the left leg to the right and knit through the extra stitch. Then knit the last 2 stitches and all the stitches on the returning pass for a total of 12 stitches. All right, now let's see how this looks. Here we have our first row of increases. KFB here and KBF here. Here's the second row of increases, the KFB and KBF. Finally, our last row of increases, KFB here and the KBF here. So this is the technical way to work this particular set of increases. Now, let's compare my modified version of this increase, the KP and PK. You can definitely see a small gap where the increases are worked. We don't see those gaps with the KFB and KBF, but other than that, they look the same. The modified version is easier, but the technical version looks better overall. So you decide which you like best. In our fifth and final segment, we're going to be learning how to work the right lifted increase and the left lifted increase. I'll begin with a small swatch of 6 stitches and 2 rows. Each increase will be worked on the third stitch from each edge, so we'll always have 2 stitches along the edges. We'll be working the right lifted increase, or RLI, and the left lifted increase, or LLI, in this demonstration. These increases add an extra degree of difficulty than the previous 3 techniques. So let's begin by knitting our first 2 stitches, making sure the edge stitch is just as big as, if not a tad bigger than the rest, to compensate for the diagonal slant. To work the right lifted increase, or RLI, we'll be working to the right of our third stitch in the stitch directly below the third stitch. So we're actually creating the increase on the third stitch on row 1, which is right here. We do that by grabbing the right leg of this third stitch on row 1, lifting it to the right and above our slack between the second and third stitches on row 1. Then we knit through the right leg of the third stitch on row 1 to work the increase. Then we knit the third stitch on row 2 to complete the increase. So again, here's the increase, and then here's our regular stitch. So to work the left lifted increase, or LLI, we first need to knit the regular stitch. Now, since we've already knitted our stitch for row 3, we're going to need to go to the stitch directly below it 2 rows down, rather than just the 1, to work the third stitch from the left on row 1 to perform the increase. If we don't knit this stitch on the third row, it's still just the 1 row below, like the RLI, but we have to lift the left leg this time to do that. So we have to knit that stitch first, okay? In doing so, we're forced to go down 2 rows below that stitch to reach the third stitch from the left on row 1. Now, again, we lift the left leg above the slack and knit through it to work the actual increase and complete the increase as a whole. So here's our regular stitch. Here's the increase stitch from the left leg of the stitch 2 rows below. Then we'll knit the last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 8 stitches. Let's take a quick look at what we have. We can see that the piece as a whole is fanning out, but so far the columns aren't splitting into diagonal slants versus vertical ones. So let's continue by knitting the first 2 stitches, bringing us to the third stitch from the right. Since we're working a right lifted increase, or RLI, the increase needs to be to the right of this third stitch. Therefore, we locate the stitch directly below it, 1 row down from row 4. So this stitch here is in row 3. Here's that right leg and the left leg. Now we want to grab that right leg, lift it above the slack, and knit through it to work the increase stitch. Then we knit our third stitch to complete the increase. Here's the increase stitch, and we now have 2 stitches between our increases. So we'll knit these 2 stitches, bringing us to the third stitch from the left. With the left lifted increase, or LLI, we need to work the increased stitch to the left of our third stitch. So we must first knit that stitch. Now we need to locate the third stitch from the left on row 3. So we need to go 2 rows directly below our third stitch this time. Then lift that leg above the slack and knit through it to work and complete the increase. And that's our LLI. Here is the regular stitch, and here's the increased stitch. Now we'll knit the last 2 stitches along with all the stitches on the return pass for a total of 10 stitches. And let's take another quick look at what we have. We're still seeing a pretty seamless transition here with the entire piece just fanning out without any real separation between diagonal slanted columns and vertical columns like we saw in the previous 3 techniques. So let's work this one last time. Knit those first 2 stitches, bringing us to the third stitch from the right. We want to work our RLI to the right of this third stitch. So we'll locate the stitch directly below it, 1 row down in row 7. Now lift that right leg above the slack and knit through it. This is the increased stitch. Now to complete the increase, we'll knit that third stitch. We have 4 stitches between our increases now, so we'll knit these next 4 stitches. That brings us to the third stitch from the left, and the LLI needs to be worked to the left of our third stitch. So we just knit this one first as the regular stitch. And now we need to locate the stitch directly below our third stitch 2 rows down. One little tip if you're struggling with finding the 2 rows down, you'll know you have the right stitch when you can see the slack exiting the stitch. There's no slack connecting these 2 stitches yet because we have yet to create it. So if we don't have any slack to lift our leg over, we're not on the right stitch. We have to go down 1 more row to get to the right stitch. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so now we'll lift that leg over the slack and knit through it to work and complete this increase. Then we'll knit the last 2 stitches along with every stitch on the return pass for a total of 12 stitches. Let's take one last look at what we have. Again, that transition is pretty seamless. When we compare it with the Make One technique, we can see the rough spots created by twisting our slack to create that extra stitch. Whereas with the lifted increases, there's no twisting at all. It's a completely smooth transition. Now, this isn't a huge difference, so the technique you use is really preferential. Now, you just have more tools in your box when working someone else's pattern or creating your own.
I hope you found this comparative demonstration helpful. Play around with the different techniques to get a feel for them. I think you'll find that adding these techniques to your tool belt helps to hone your skills and increase the quality of your work to achieve your personal vision. If you have any questions or need help with anything, please do not hesitate to comment below or email me at support@justspoolinaround.com. Thanks again for watching. Peace out, all you hand knitting lovies. Until next time.